Good morning from Studio 57 here in New York. I'm Anne-Marie Green, and
I'm Jeff Glor in for Vladimir Duthier.
Yeah, we don't see Jeff, during the week. I mean, he's busy working and preparing for the weekend,
Yes.
But it's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
And of course, it's a big day, so let's get right to the midterm elections. And so far, some of the races haven't turned out the way many predicted. With 5 Senate races still too close to call, it is a toss-up who will control the upper chamber. Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Alaska still don't have a winner. Control of the House is leaning Republican, but just barely. Democrats overall are doing much better than expected.
CBS News says projected winners in 2 key races. Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to hold on to his job by a wide margin in Florida, and Pennsylvania's Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman is projected to win one of the state's U.S. Senate seats.
I'm proud of what we ran on. Protecting a woman's right to choose, raising our minimum wage, fighting the union way of life.
We faced attacks. We took the hits. We weathered the storms, but we stood our ground. We did not back down. We had the conviction to guide us, and we had the courage to lead.
Philip Bump is here in Studio 57 with us to talk a little bit more about how these races are looking. He is a national columnist for The Washington Post, and I'm really glad to have you here. I don't know how many different variations on the theme of water flow I have heard this morning. Wave, tsunami, trickle, sprinkle, you name it. The thesaurus is exhausted. But that being said, the expectation was that there would be a red wave. It doesn't so much look like that. What's your take on this?
Yeah, no, it is very surprising. I mean, one of the things that I've been looking at over the course of the campaign is the fact that presidents, first of all, presidents, when they have the first midterm election of their administration, it tends to go against them anyway, particularly when the president isn't very popular. Stuck in the old ways. Joe Biden's approval rating here is just north of 40%. That historically has meant, losing dozens of seats by his party. That's not what's shaping up to happen here. So just by the fundamentals, something strange was underway. The fact that the Senate also remains close, it's just an astonishing break from what we've come to expect from historic.
What's interesting, though, is if you looked at Florida early in the night, it looked like that wave, or whatever you're going to call it, might happen. Florida right now, at least, as far as we know, doesn't necessarily look like the rest of the country.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Voting-wise, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, so we've seen this pattern now for 3 cycles. In 2018, early results came in showing very close race in Florida when it was expected to be a Dem wave year. It ended up being a Dem wave year. So those early Florida returns were sort of surprising. In Florida in 2020, the shift among Hispanic voters was something that caught people by surprise. Was that going to carry over to the rest of the country? It didn't. 2022, we see this early jump by DeSantis and Rubio, which is absolutely in part a function of who they're running against. Charlie Crist has now lost, almost countless races in that state. But it still is, Florida is doing something different than the rest of the country. And even our model at the Washington Post, we have a model that's based on returns that are coming in. Our model wasn't working right because it was based so heavily on Florida because Florida came in first. Florida is just different. And that's good news for Democrats.
So let's talk about Pennsylvania, because every heavy hitter came to Pennsylvania over and over and over again. And we did some polling asking Pennsylvania voters what was important to them. Right. And surprisingly to me, they had abortion above the economy. Right. That's not what we were hearing before across the board. The economy was everything. And so what's your take on the outcome here? I also want to remind people, too, which is something I thought of earlier, Pat Toomey is the outgoing senator. He's a senator that voted in favor of impeachment for Donald Trump. So we're talking about a Republican who's not a hard right, if you will.
Yeah, there was a big push, particularly by Republicans in Pennsylvania, to frame Fetterman as being soft on crime, right? That doesn't appear to have landed. And that was something that happened nationally as well. We saw a lot of those sorts of pushes on crime. So that doesn't seem to have affected it. I mean, I think what this really reflects is that Pennsylvania really is a purple state. We used to think it was a pretty blue state. That's clearly not the case anymore, but it's not a red state, right? I mean, we saw that in 2020, obviously, to some extent as well. But Dr. Oz, I think Fetterman did a really good job right off the bat of characterizing him as something foreign to Pennsylvania, both in the sense of that he was from New Jersey and that he was closer to Trump than people realized. Whether or not that's true, the voters seem to have thought it was.
Another purple state that we've talked about Florida so far. We talked about Pennsylvania, Ohio. Surprised by the J.D. Vance win?
I am not at all surprised by the J.D. Vance win. I went to Ohio State. I went to high school in Northeast Ohio, so I feel like I have a pretty good sense. We always have to lay out our credentials here. But I think that considering Ohio to be sort of a swing state is that's just not the case anymore. I mean, yes, it is the case that Sherrod Brown got elected to the Senate from Ohio, but this was pretty clearly a race all along where J.D. Vance had a different sort of persona he was bringing to the race, and in a state that is much more heavily Republican than I think a lot of people realize.
So then, I know we always ask this question, but about former President Trump's influence.
Sure.
J.D. Vance obviously may or may not have benefited from it, or maybe he was a different type of candidate. In Pennsylvania, it didn't work out for Mastriano. It didn't work out for Dr. Oz. Can we come to any conclusions based on what we're seeing now?
Yeah, I mean, this was pretty categorically a bad day for Donald Trump. It was a bad day for Donald Trump both because Ron DeSantis did super well, who's obviously going to be one of his competitors in 2024, but it was just a bad day because a lot of his picks, a lot of people who he pushed out there are either struggling or have lost. Kerry Lake in Arizona, for example. I think Pennsylvania is interesting because the only reason Trump ended up endorsing Mastriano is because he was worried Oz was going to lose his primary and he wanted to have sort of a backup for it. But even there, Mastriano got absolutely obliterated, which I think is also reflective of Pennsylvania being a purple state.
Yeah. So listen, we have Robert Costa. He's standing by at the other studio in Times Square. We're waiting for him to sort of jump in. There you are. Listen, Bob, let me ask you a question. Are you hearing anything from President Biden and former President Trump about the results?
Well, not directly at this moment, but I'm hearing from allies of President Biden and allies of former President Trump. On the Trump front, this was a disappointing night ahead of a possible announcement of an exploratory committee or even a formal announcement of a 2024 bid next week. And what you're seeing now from Trump's circle is an attempt to explain their positioning in the coming days about, they're trying to explain their positioning in the coming days as they look toward 2024.
I think that we were having some sort of audio problems with Bob.
Might be getting a little mixed without minus, as we call it in the business here. But yeah, there was some, Philip, we can talk to you about that as well. I mean, there was talk about Trump maybe making this declaration even tomorrow night or having some sort of an announcement from Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
At this point, that would appear highly unlikely. I mean, Bob called it a disappointing night for Donald Trump. I would call it a very, very disappointing night for him.
No, I think that's exactly right. And, Bob's obviously done great reporting on this. Yeah, I mean, I think that Donald Trump has been very effective at capturing the attention and belief system of a subset of the Republican base. And I think that he is going to continue to be able to present to that subset of the Republican base the idea that everything that went wrong for Trump last night was not Trump's fault. The question is, can he expand beyond that? And if he's seeking to jump into the 2024 race, which seems likely, if he's not able to expand beyond that core base that he can convince that everything was fine yesterday, then he's got a real problem.
Here's my question. What do you think it is that some Republicans are liking about Ron DeSantis now that they maybe are not liking about Donald Trump?
I think there are two things that overlap. The first is that he has shown that he can win in a state that is still considered to be purple, even though I think it's probably more red than people realize. But the second thing is that he is not Donald Trump, that he does not carry the baggage of Donald Trump, that he is not facing indictment, that he is not loathed by, a large portion of the American electorate. All of those things, the fact that Ron DeSantis is benefiting here from the fact that he isn't Trump, I think can't be understated, and also reflects that there is a strong sentiment in the Republican base for someone who doesn't carry the last name Trump.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you think there was something sort of simmering under the surface even before when he said, Ron DeSanctimonious?
Yeah.
It did not land.
Yeah.
At all. And almost immediately, I was surprised to see people openly criticizing him for doing that. Why would you criticize a Republican right before the election? But also sort of talking about new blood. And it just seemed to happen like with one misstep of a line.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you've seen two trains coming down the track toward each other for months and months and months, and we all knew this was coming, right? I think everyone was sort of a little surprised that it came before the election. I think in part that was Donald Trump trying to, sort of give it a little jab at Ron DeSantis. He said that, by the way, outside of Florida when he had a rally in Florida. He was not making those comments. But yeah, I mean, look, everyone's known this is coming. I think Ron DeSantis can be very happy with where he's positioned this morning.
Right.
What are the biggest races you're still watching? What are the biggest question marks this morning?
I think Arizona. The Democrats at the gubernatorial and Senate races have leads there, but those leads are not super solid. If Kerry Lake wins, if Blake Masters wins in the Senate race, that's a big shift in Arizona that may have potential ramifications for 2024.